My name is John Dodson. I'm an urban farmer in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm for the soil because without healthy soil, there's no healthy food. With no healthy food, there's no healthy life.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and joining me, my co-host, Dr. Eric Bendfeldt with Virginia Cooperative Extension, Community Viability, and returning after a couple of episodes on leave or vacation, shall we say, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Mary, it's good to have you back again. Would you introduce our special guest today?
Thanks, Jeff. And it's great to be here with you, Eric, and Madelyn Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Common Grain Alliance. Common Grain Alliance is a partner of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, really working to bring back or invigorate the local grain economy. Madelyn has a really interesting background in conservation policy and agricultural policy and coalition building, and then has taken her passion for grains and small grains to work with the Common Grain Alliance. So excited to hear more about your background and how you're bringing that to the work. So I guess for starters, Madelyn, just would, love to hear a little bit what brought you to the Common Grain Alliance. How have you moved from working in DC in the policy realm to working with farmers on the ground?
Sure. Well, I have a background in facilitation and agricultural policy. So my undergraduate degree was in natural resources, ecology, and management. And then I came to DC to work for a nonprofit consultancy firm that specialized in facilitating collaboration and related to a broad range of environmental issues. A stroke of luck, I guess, that I was assigned to help staff and facilitate a group of Midwestern grain farmers, environmental NGOs, agricultural economists, and former government officials who are working together to advocate for federal policy reforms, and particularly to make changes to the federal crop insurance program to acknowledge that soil health and conservation practices actually reduce agricultural risk. So that's what I worked on for the first 4 years of my career, really getting into the nitty-gritty of federal crop insurance and other federal conservation programs and how they could work better for expanding adoption of conservation practices. And towards the end of my time at that facilitating that coalition, we really started to talk more about diversified systems. The conversation was really shifting from just a focus on how do we get more cover crops and no-till practices to how do we start thinking about bringing more diversity onto the farm and into cropping systems. And I was speaking with some of our Midwestern grain farmers who said, we already grow rye as a cover crop. I would love to be able to sell my rye, but there's no buyer for it. And what would really be effective, instead of trying to pay farmers $5 an acre to plant cover crops, if there was actually a market for those cover crops, that would be a built-in incentive. And that's what would really inspire broad-scale adoption across the entire United States for planting of small grain crops, which are a really important part of diversified crop rotations. And that's what really got me thinking, why aren't there markets for small grains like rye or oats in particular? As a general consumer, the question about oats really struck me because I was like, I eat oatmeal every single morning. What are you telling me that there's no market for oats in the United States? Where are all of the food companies who sell oats getting their oats from? And they're all importing them from Canada. And that is what really made me interested in working at the Common Grain Alliance, because what this organization is doing is really building a regional market for these small grain crops that are such an important part of diversified crop rotations and creating high value regional markets. So what Common Grain Alliance does is we really connect grain farmers, grain processors, and grain buyers in the Mid-Atlantic region. And so we're building those supply chains and those market relationships. And what I think is so interesting is that the buyers within the Common Grain Alliance network are folks who are looking for high quality, sustainably grown grain. They really want to know their grain farmers, and they're willing to pay a price premium for it because most of them are creating craft food and beverage products that they're going to sell at a higher price to consumers for that craft quality. So I think it's really an interesting mechanism for driving broader conservation adoption.
And Madelyn, the Common Grain Alliance is still relatively young as an organization. I know your colleague Heather Coyner has shared some information, but just giving a little bit more history of the Common Grain Alliance.
Common Grain Alliance was founded in 2018 by a group of bakers, grain farmers, and millers who were kind of dreaming together about what they wanted their regional food system for grain to look like. And I'm really glad that you spoke with Heather because she was one of the kind of primary founders and a real driver and leader of the organization for many years. And so the group started in Roseland, Virginia. They have a beautiful origin story of having some of their first meetings in the basement of a public library, and it's really grown and taken off from there. The organization has had quarterly meetings throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, but primarily in Virginia for the kind of 5 years of its development, and that has really allowed it to kind of grow its membership, to make new connections, to bring in more grain farmers, grain processors, and buyers to the meetings. And I was hired at the beginning of October of last year, 2023. So I'm about to be in the month 6 of my tenure at Common Grain Alliance. And I'm the first full-time executive director. So we've had executive directors in the past, but they've always been part-time positions. And so my hiring kind of represents a next step forward in terms of growing the capacity and the reach of the organization to have someone full-time really dedicated to growing the network and thinking about what other programs we can develop to expand the reach and the impact of the organization.
We're talking today with Madelyn Smith, Executive Director of the Common Grain Alliance. And Madelyn, I wanted to ask you about your website. I was exploring the website earlier today, and I'm totally impressed on all of the resources available at commongrainalliance.org. For instance, there's a menu bar at the top, and if I click on Shop Grain, there's all sorts of information there about shopping for Mid-Atlantic grains. For instance, example, maybe I'm running a bakery in, I don't know, Bethesda, Maryland, and I want to buy local grains for my bakery. I can go to this website and I can find all of the local sources of wheat and barley and rye and oats and whatever grain I'm looking for. I can source that through your website. And also another interesting area of the website on the menu bar is Learn. And there I clicked on the Growing Grain Handbook, and that is absolutely filled with information about all sorts of educational barriers for growing grain for local market. It's information on how new and experienced farmers growing on the either small scale or mid scale, they can refer to these documents for considerations for incorporating grains into their farming business. And tell me more about this alliance and network you're trying to build.
Soil health is a big driver of what the Common Grain Alliance has always been about. And I think that's why there's been such a good partnership between Common Grain Alliance and the Virginia Soil Health Coalition for so many years. And I think where that really comes from is the folks within the Common Grain Alliance network. We have 120 members who represent each stage of the regional grain value chain. So grain growers, grain processors, mills, and maltsters who are processing grain, and then end users of grain. So artisan bakers, maltsters, pasta makers, brewers. There is a real understanding and desire to drive sustainable agriculture through the network. So the folks who are buying grain, one of the motivations for doing so is in order to have a connection to the farmers in their area and to be able to have access to sustainably grown organic grain. So when you think about why a baker, an artisan baker, would be willing to pay twice as much for grain that they're buying from a farmer, it's because they want to know how those grains are produced. And they also want to be able to tell the story of that grain and make the argument to their buyer about, why they should care that they're eating a loaf of bread baked with flour that was grown and milled in Virginia. So I think that the small grains play a really important part in the creating soil health on a farm. They can really help with reducing the need for external fertilizers and for the need for pesticides. They can reduce pest pressure if you integrate them into crop rotations. I'm not a soil health expert, so my understanding is pretty high level, but it's about both making sure that there's a healthy farm ecosystem on the farm and also creating markets that can help drive greater crop diversification, and then communicating that story to the end consumer about why that's important.
Madelyn, one of the things that I find so interesting about the Common Grain Alliance is how it's kind of tackling this full life cycle of the grain, if you will, from, you're working on the practices and the implementation side and educating producers on conservation practices, peer-to-peer education, but you're also working up that chain with the manufacturers, the buyers, and the consumers and the policymakers. One piece of that, which I know there's some unique components in grain production, is the infrastructure piece. Is that a limiting factor in the Mid-Atlantic? And how's the Common Grain Alliance involved in that?
Great question.
I think it's one of the limiting factors for expanding production and consumption of grain that's grown regionally. And it's something that we're actively talking about and figuring out how to tackle as a collaborative of small business owners who are all sharing some of the same struggles with supply chain infrastructure. Distribution costs are really high because we don't have the economies of scale for, trucking train cars of grain. So when you're talking about, just transporting a couple of tons of grain and the shipping and distribution costs there, those distribution costs are very high. Grain storage is also a challenge. Grain needs to be stored in a temperature controlled environment at a certain moisture level in order to prevent pests from proliferating in that grain and the growth of mold. So having enough temperature controlled cold storage within the regional grain value chain is a challenge. And then grain cleaning equipment is also a barrier, because if you are a grower who's growing commodity grain and you're selling to a grain elevator or another kind of commodity channel, if you're growing with pesticides and with other herbicides and fungicides, when you harvest your grain in the combine, it's pretty clean already. Because there's not that much else on your field except the crop that you're trying to grow. And so you just bring that to the grain elevator, they take everything you have and you're done with it. But if you're growing with more organic growing practices or trying to reduce your use of external inputs, and you're selling to a regional buyer that doesn't have the same grain storage infrastructure on their mill or at their malt house, number one, when you harvest your grain, there's going to be other things mixed in there. Wild garlic in particular is a challenge because it grows to the same height as wheat and the seeds are a very similar size. So there are extra steps to cleaning out those other weeds, seeds that might be in your harvest to get it really clean for your buyer. And then if you're selling it to a mill that might not be able to take everything that you have because they just simply don't have the grain storage. So those are the challenges with the extra grain cleaning equipment, building up the capacity and infrastructure for storing grain within the regional grain supply chain, and trying to bring down those distribution costs. And we are actively having conversations within the Common Grain Alliance network about what we can do as on a kind of collaborative basis to help address those concerns and build up infrastructure that can benefit the regional grain supply chain overall.
And Madelyn, for farmers and people that are within the food value chain, how can they become involved with Common Grain Alliance?
Common Grain Alliance is a membership-based organization. So we have quarterly member meetings that are throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and other events that are really designed for information sharing and technical assistance between our members. And as an aside, I'm glad that you mentioned some of the resources on our website. That is really part of our effort to document a lot of the knowledge that is held in the brains of the many knowledgeable members of the Common Grain Alliance, trying to get that down on paper and make that more available to people who are interested in what it takes to sell into the regional grain value chain, because it is a little bit different than selling into commodity grain channels. So that's really the intention of the Growing Grain Handbook, is for a farmer who wants to understand all of the different considerations for selling regionally rather than growing grain for a commodity channel. So there's this immense knowledge base that is held within the minds of all of our Common Grain Alliance members. And so one thing that I think is really unique about the network is how willing folks are to share that information with others. So we have these quarterly member meetings to really facilitate that information exchange, the networking, the formation of business relationships. It's a really great place for folks who either don't grow grain yet, but are interested in forming those business connections and want to step into the grain world, or folks who are growing grain already, but selling to commodity channels and want to form those relationships for selling regionally. So those member meetings are a great way to be involved, and to sign up for our newsletter to get more information about all of the events that we put on.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up in this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. But Madelyn, I want to say thank you for everything you do, and also to remind our listeners about all the resources available at the website commongrainalliance.org. There's educational resources, networking resources, buyers, sellers of small grains here in the Mid-Atlantic region, all sorts of information there at commongrainalliance.org. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, just call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.